People. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth or fifth, I'm losing track, fourth webinar with the Defend Research team in conversation with different experts on issues of censorship and scholarly communications and scientific research. If you are joining us, if you could just pop into the chat where you are, if you want, and what role you have in scholarly communications, or if you don't, that would be very interesting as well. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. Pop that in there as well. And if you can also confirm in the chat if you can see my screen and hear me okay, that would be great. And we have about 150 people signed up. So I will give folks a chance to join us coming from across the globe. Very cool to see all the different places everyone is coming from. And to Lisa's point, really, really important. If you do prefer to stay anonymous, please feel free to do that. Rename your title and make sure if and when you ask questions, you just remind that you want to stay anonymous. We recognize that not everyone has the same flexibility in sharing their background. So great. It looks like people are able to hear everything okay. See the screen. We'll give things one more minute. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. The session is being recorded. So again, we will stop recording. Someone make sure to remind me during the Q&A so folks can speak more freely. George is going to be presenting a summary of some really interesting research. So I'm hoping we can keep the conversation going in the chat, but reserve actually discussion until the end of his presentation. So I will try to pick out threads and questions from the chat while George is doing his presentation. So again, really excited to see such global representation. And with that, let me see what time it is. Can we give folks one more minute to see who joins us? Are there any questions just in terms of logistics from our audience members? Feel free to pop them in the chat. And there is a Q&A box I see. So if you want to tee up actual questions, please feel free to pop those in there too. And I will try to keep track of all of the balls at one time. All right. With that, let's go ahead and get started, and hopefully folks will be able to join as and when, and feel free to keep the chat going as well. So good morning, good afternoon. As I said, my name is Sara Rouhi. I'm one of the co-authors on the Declaration to Defend Research from U.S. Government Censorship. And I am really delighted to keep the ball rolling on our 2026 webinar series, conversations with experts across fields, across subject areas, on the issue of censorship and scholarly publishing and scholarly communication. I've wanted to have George on the webinar series for a really long time because of the research he's been doing in this very work in China. So it's really a delight to be able to have this conversation with him today. Just a brief overview of the Declaration and its origins. There are 5 of us working across scholarly communications who came together in February of 2025 as the onslaught of executive orders attacking science funding, but most shockingly in some ways, specific words in the context of research as a means to erase entire groups, entire bodies of vital research from women's health to minority communities. And we were quite shocked by the lack of engagement by the institutions in scholarly publishing not really stepping up, and quite a few engaging in kind of anticipatory compliance. So as you can see, none of us here are affiliating with our employers. All of us are doing this work in our personal capacity as private citizens and activists. But you can find our orchids. You probably find us on LinkedIn. You can see what work we do by day. We represent a really wide swath of the scholarly communications community. But we are all identifying as private citizens in the context of our conversations today. And if you are engaging in a discussion, feel free to articulate what hat you're wearing as you engage. Just a reminder, and I think George's work is really going to underscore this, that none of this is new. I don't know about you, but the last 24 hours has felt very new as both a U.S. citizen, a immigrant from Iran and a person working in this space. But I think it is important to remember that most of this is not new. Certainly the censorship in science as a means to push political outcomes. So this is a article from Nature in 1937 calling out the very specific concern that scientific inquiry can only develop to its full extent in an atmosphere of political freedom. And the kinds of attacks on language specifically are very, very intentional to limit political freedom in the context of scientific inquiry. So I wanted to show you more of this article, but it is paywalled. So open access may set this free, but for now, that's an overview of the abstract. So again, we are focusing on censorship. Many other organizations are doing vital work, raising the alarm on cuts to funding, on attacks on different scientific institutions, on the closing of vital sources of data in climate change and many other areas. We're focusing on censorship because I think as scholarly communications professionals, that feels particularly insidious, which is why George's research is going to be really interesting. So just a bit about me. I've been working in scholarly publishing, scientific society publishing and technology for about the last 15 years, but my background is in political science. And so that's kind of the lens I bring to our work. And as I said, I'm a woman of color and immigrant. So for me, a lot of the rights embodied in the Constitution as an immigrant are really powerful and important. And so these attacks, as someone who has historically been proud of her naturalization and citizenship, have been particularly troubling. So I'm very grateful to my colleagues here for giving me a forum and a place to do this kind of work, and grateful to all of you attending for caring about the work and supporting us irrespective of where you're located. If you haven't actually signed the declaration, encourage you to take a look at it. All the QR codes on the slides are links to the declaration itself. We ask signatories to try to do one to all of the calls to action you see here on the slides. Our website has a lot of resources for how to do this. So if you are looking for ways to engage that feel like they give you a space that feels safe to do that, definitely encourage you to look at our website and to, just stop and think, given your legal and political context, what is the best form of resistance for you? Putting your name on a publicly accessible piece of resistance may not be the safest thing for you. So just, if you're a white man in the UK, maybe signing is no big deal. If you're a woman of color on an H-1B visa in the US, maybe think twice. Just think about where you sit and know that there are many forms of resistance that don't have to just be public necessarily. And with that, the webinar will be recorded. We will turn it off though at the Q&A so people can speak freely. Any questions, audio issues, email us. Our colleagues at Scholastica, who are so generously supporting our webinar infrastructure, will all work together in the background to help you if you have any AV issues. And with that, I'm really delighted to introduce George, also a scholarly communications professional, but presenting today in his capacity as a lecturer at UCL. George was very generous in getting a random message, I think, on LinkedIn. I think that's how I messaged you, George, from a total stranger saying, oh my God, the work that you're doing is really important. Can we talk? And since then, George has been in a couple different conversations. You can see him on stage with me and colleagues at CERN during the Open Science Fair in Switzerland last fall. So we've had a lot of opportunities to talk about his work, but never in the depth that I really would like. So it's a real privilege, George, to introduce you and give you the opportunity to take the floor here and tell us about your research. And then in the chat, we can keep the convo going. And then once we dive into the Q&A, I'll try to pull threads out of the chat and kick off the conversation there. So with that, I'll stop sharing. And George, go ahead and bring your slides up. And in the meantime, I will keep an eye on the chat and answer any questions happening in the background. And if you have questions you want to make sure we don't lose in the chat, please drop those in the Q&A. And with that, I'll go on mute and take it away, George.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah, and everyone involved in the Defend Research work for inviting me to have this forum to talk about my research in this level of detail and to maybe source some feedback from you as well about some of the kind of proposals and findings that came out of it. Yeah, it's a real privilege to be part of this, and I really appreciate the work that you're all doing. So yeah, very excited to discuss this some more in the Q&A afterwards as well. So as Sarah mentioned, I have a background in scholarly publishing. I worked for about 14 years as well before switching over to academia. So alongside that, I was doing a PhD. And the work that I'm going to report today came out of that PhD. There's a fair bit to get through, so I'm going to launch straight in, and I'll tell you a bit about the structure of what I'm going to cover today. So I'll give you a brief overview of the research context and design for the PhD, summary of the findings that came out of it between the period that I was doing that research, so it was 6 years part-time alongside my job in scholarly publishing, so 2018 to 24, focusing on China, as we'll see. But I'd like to kind of try and tease out, and I have been since then, some parallels, some reasonably alarming parallels we're seeing in the US context that I think are kind of raising the importance of discussing ways that we might better regulate and better manage the scholarly record, involving more stakeholders beyond scholarly publishers to a wider network potentially of actors to set policies for what constitutes censorship and how we might prevent it, which seems to be highly relevant to this advocacy group. So really excited to get your feedback on that side of things particularly. So to take you back to what now seems to me like ancient history, really there were kind of 2 points in my life around the mid-2010s where I had this strange feeling that a kind of news headline was somehow addressing me directly. The first was when I read a Guardian notification on my phone about a major incident that had been declared at a power station, Didcot power station, that I was looking at. I was commuting home from my work, my day job at TNF, got this notification, and shortly afterwards, there was a huge incident and the power station collapsed, which was a very eerie and kind of quite alarming experience, as if I'd kind of caused this event through my kind of idle glance. Not long after that, I also saw a headline, the headline on the left, which kind of gave me a similar sort of feeling. It confirmed a rumor that had been doing the rounds for some time, that in late 2017, several leading scholarly publishers had received quite a stark ultimatum from Chinese research importers that they need to curate their online collections on behalf of the Chinese state in order to continue trading into China. What was most alarming as well to me was that some were exploring, from what I'd heard, over the water cooler, technical solutions to comply with this request. This kind of these rumors were doing around just as I was mulling over a PhD to liven up my social life, potentially a kind of continuation of past academic interests in politics and philosophy. So all of a sudden I was presented by what struck me as a deeply philosophical dilemma facing the publishing industry when censorship manifests in this way in terms of the delivery of scholarly research in a global market and in China particularly. So I started taking notes from that point. So what surprised me, as did others, I think in the industry, it's fair to say, is that Cambridge University Press was the first that got caught up in this publicly, and that it had done so in a way that suggested quite a knee-jerk position of compliance. So they immediately removed over 300 items of content, including articles and book reviews, from the China-facing online records of one of the leading area studies journals. They faced immediate backlash in the form of press coverage, petitions, broad-based condemnation from the academic community, and they reversed their decision very quickly, within 3 days, actually. As part of that, quite helpfully for my own research, they released the details of all content that had been affected. And at the time, as you can see on the right, some analysis was conducted. You can see that most of that content included what we might consider quite politically fraught keywords in the Chinese context, from sort of Cultural Revolution to Falun Gong, Xinjiang, and others. In the months and years that followed, we discovered that Cambridge University Press was not the only and certainly not the last to face this dilemma. And alongside the 300 articles that they removed, Springer Nature took the decision to remove 1,000 articles or make them inaccessible via their search, the first search function of their platform for 2 journals along similar lines. a news report came out that over 100 articles had been blocked in Index on Censorship, kind of ironically somewhat, published by Sage. Not clear whether that was through Sage's actions or the actions of an intermediary, but certainly, again, similar content, similar keywords were unavailable in that journal. And then Taylor and Francis, at that time my employer, released a statement in 2018 that over 80 journals would no longer be available in the content packages they sell to Chinese universities because of concerns about the content that they publish. So these events fed into a research design that I put forward for a PhD. Obviously, these aren't isolated in the kind of context of the politicization of research in China. But for me, I thought they warranted further study because I think they represent a very specific and quite unknown or little known form of censorship complicity. So this is censorship occurring post-publication with the alleged involvement of scholarly publishers outside of China, enforcing constraints on behalf of the Chinese state. So I wanted to know, how did this position come about, and how might it be avoided in future where you have publishers doing the work of the state? This is a substantive component of the research that I'd like to talk to you about today will be the interview part of this study, which you can see on the right as part of the design. And just to say a little bit more about that, I interviewed 12 publishers and 12 academics, most of whom had direct experience of this form of censorship, with representation across different organizational types, from commercial to university presses, independent publishers, and so on, different levels of seniority as well, as we'll see in some of the reports. And obviously, half of those participants were academics who had had their content blocked in China with the involvement of a publisher. So this interview study generated 12 themes. I used thematic analysis to analyze the transcripts that I put together. Sadly, I don't have time to take you through all of these, so I'm going to concentrate on 5, as we'll see in a moment. At the end of the presentation, there is a link and details of work cited. You can find out the full thematic analysis. You can see the full details of my findings in a preprint that was that I released towards the end of last year. And I'd be happy to send that round to the group afterwards if that's of interest. But yeah, today I'd like to talk about 5 themes in particular that, again, I think suggest maybe some parallels in the US context and certainly raise some issues about how censorship is managed, handled, regulated in the industry. The first, which we'll look at, is about how self-censorship is a consequence of China's economic power. And we know when the economic stakes are quite high for publishers, they might feel greater pressure to comply with censorship. Then we'll look at how responsibility is managed or deferred. This process of normalization that occurs as well over time. How uncertainty is managed by the affected parties somewhat strategically. And then also the requirement for external parties to try and encourage greater collaboration in the industry to resist censorship. To begin with this first theme, and for each of these, I've given you a sense of the coverage, so the number of participants who gave a response that contributes to each theme. So in this case, it's more publishers and academics, understandably, talked a bit in more detail about the kind of underlying conditions of censorship. And for those participants, as you can see from some of the quotations here, that the size and the strategic importance of China and China's market was identified as a key condition of compliance. Particularly, as I say, the publisher's interview. So we here see from Bilal, if you see a first name, I should say it's a publisher. If it's a surname given, as we'll see in a few other slides, it's an academic speaking. So Bilal says, and these are all pseudonyms, regardless of whether you're a commercial publisher or a non-profit, you are in some ways incentivized to make profit or bring in revenue so that your non-profit entity is sustainable. China's a massive market and you're going to want to have access to that. So I think this kind of underscores that it's not just about the big commercial players, it's all sorts of different types of publishers of different organizational types could be implicated in this and could feel the pressure to comply with censorship. There are many types of economic motivations that were mentioned, things like reliance on journal sales deals, subscription revenues, submissions and citations from China as well to sustain revenue and business growth. And again, so interviewees highlighted the scale of the market and the leverage that China has versus other markets where publishers might set the terms themselves better or more effectively. For Harris, again, these concerns cut across all sorts of different types of publishers, If you start getting accessibility issues in China, he says that has a very direct, immediate impact on things like impact factor, so that prestige measure that everyone who uses your product will care about, and that these are anxieties that any sizable company would face. So just kind of, again, underscoring the spread of these concerns.
George, can I ask a quick question? You said the
Yeah,
last names indicate researchers that you talk to, and the
yeah,
first names indicate publishers. Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
So this will be a
Sometimes
bit
it's
clearer
hard
on
to
the
tell which are which. Got
Yeah,
it.
it'll become a bit clearer in the next slides because we have like Dr. Alder, for example, or Professor. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. Um, so the next theme then is around how responsibility is managed, and again, more publishers and academics spoke about this. Um, Among the 12 publishers, most tended to distribute agency, I found, in ways that shifted the burden of responsibility to resist censorship or to kind of deal with censorship concerns to individuals occupying different roles and at different levels of seniority. So, understandably, lower level staff tended to emphasize a hierarchy of decision making that would make them prevent them from operating autonomously. What was interesting, though, is that staff occupying those more senior positions also gave responses that tended to distribute agency either among a committee of other senior level staff or back down the chain to lower levels in different departmental functions, claiming that they'd made kind of short-sighted tactical judgments without their oversight. So again, this is kind of like this moving target of responsibility through the organization. Stepping outside of individual organizations at the kind of trade body level. I had an interview here with Pierre, who was a representative of a prominent trade body at the time, also kind of denying responsibility to coordinate a response to resist censorship or to dictate to individual publishers how they ought to approach or forge a consensus. So again, opening up this kind of gap, I suppose, that someone might need to fill in order to accept responsibility to resist. So moving on to kind of knowledge of censorship and how that was managed. And I think this theme really illustrates how uncertainty operates both as a kind of consequence of censorship, but also as a tool to prevent scrutiny. So we see this from both sides, from, say, Carolyn, who's a publisher occupying a sales role, describing an inability to tell whether content that's unavailable is due to censorship or because of this particular package, the kind of structure of the packages that are sold. Similarly, you have academics facing a similar kind of dilemma. So Dr. Alder here saying, published research used to be available, is now not available, possibly because subscriptions aren't there, or maybe because it's been 404. So, it's hard to distinguish between the two. It makes it hard to hold publishers to account because you can't tell the source of those access and availabilities. For some, this uncertainty reflected a deliberate strategy on behalf of publishers because self-censorship involves commercial sensitivities that can't be shared. And in one case, we had a publisher occupying a leadership position here, Oliver, who described a kind of strategic imperative to withhold information internally from other colleagues within the organization he led because he felt that there were several individuals who were loyal to the Chinese Communist Party at the time. So any broad announcements could have been reported back up the line to the Chinese state. And he describes this process of kind of trying to combat ambiguity with ambiguity, and the way that the kind of dealings with these state intermediaries and agencies, often the kind of Chinese individuals that they were dealing with were using the same sorts of tactics, so to obfuscate or avoid accountability. But obviously, this kind of creating this kind of shroud of uncertainty, both within the wider industry, between publishers, but also within the individual publishing companies themselves, which again makes kind of collaboration, a shared understanding, very difficult to achieve. So given that stated lack of agency to resist censorship and then uncertainty about its extent, several interviewees gave responses that kind of suggested apathy and a process of normalization that had occurred since the first reported case. Some of the publishers interviewed described this in terms of two factions of academic stakeholders. So some that were surprised and some that were kind of more sort of world weary, understand that this is just the way that you do business in China. Dr. Hawthorne, here a journal editor of a journal that had to censor some of its output, recognized a similar pattern. Heated discussion in forums and listservs following the initial Cambridge University Press case, initial problems for the journal because of that, and then a kind of like a gradual process where they kind of taper off, interventions failing to gain traction to the same extent as for China Quarterly. And then given these kind of processes, some of the publishers predicted that this might just not be an issue anymore. It might gradually become less of an issue. Harris here saying that for some publishers, it just gradually becomes what you do. And if importers say, yes, you can host your content, but you can't host 1,000 articles, that's just the way it is. And you don't have a choice about it. So given many of the obstacles to forged consensus, many participants gave responses that suggested that collaborative resistance relies upon external interventions, external pressure. Several of the publishers interviewed, particularly those that occupied more senior positions, emphasized some constraints stemming from market and competition law if publishers were to kind of work in concert and set the terms of sales agreements with Chinese intermediaries. For others, a precondition for collaboration would be government protection, some kind of effort to bring about a unified approach across all publishers. Interestingly, again, Oliver, coming from a senior leadership position, tried to actually achieve this by speaking to the government in the UK, he claimed, which proved unsuccessful. And it was pretty clear that they didn't want to take this forward. Later in the interview, explaining that this was just like a very small part of kind of wider political concerns in the region. It's very difficult to get much, governmental interest in this because, again, the market, the threats, the risks aren't as great as other concerns that the government might be dealing with at that time. And while cross-publisher resistance to censorship might depend on intervention from those external parties, the interviewers demonstrated how these sorts of interventions require shared knowledge and kind of pre-existing consensus. And given those conditions weren't met for the reasons we just looked at, publishers became entrenched in their own positions. And so this lack of coordination didn't come about. So I think another vital factor in this lack of coordination or resistance was the shift in press coverage that occurred during the research, which I noticed. So there's an enormous amount of attention on this particular kind of censorship at the beginning, and then its attention understandably shifted to other concerns like the role of Confucius Institutes in higher education, the implications of the Hong Kong national security law for academics in the region and globally, the way that data had been collected in some studies from minorities in Xinjiang and misused, and then other kind of examples of soft censorship, if you like, in journals where the territorial description of China might change depending on who you publish with along political lines. And then obviously COVID occurred right slap bang in the middle of the research and shifted everyone's attention to that pandemic and that crisis. And again, some kind of concerns about censorship that arose at the time. All of this important, but distracting attention, I think, from an issue that was unresolved. But I think perhaps the biggest story, though, over that period, and that's received perhaps the most attention internally to the publishing industry, has been the kind of surging output from China during this period, surpassing the US in 2022, and that of the UK and the EU, obviously. And over the same period until 2022, not only has that output grown in absolute terms, but the proportion of output that's gold open access, so free at the point of publication or paid open access, has also grown, which is great in terms of availability of research, but I think it also illustrates the revenue potential or risk involved in trying to attract submissions from China. So despite, or perhaps because of this shift in focus, my research suggests that the instances of suspected censorship also increased quite dramatically during that time. So I've got two graphs here displaying the number of items of content that were unavailable via a Chinese IP address, but available in all the other jurisdictions on a publisher's platform during the study period. This was the basis of a kind of more in-depth text mining study of the journal articles involved, all of which contained some of the kind of politically fraught keywords that we looked at earlier. So it's suggesting to me a kind of broader censorship pattern. And you see a marked increase in the amount of content that was unavailable leading up to the 5-yearly Chinese Communist Party Congress, so the 20th in 2022, following a similar pattern to the 2017 cases, but also other forms of censorship affecting social media and all other forms of kind of online communication in the lead up to these party congresses is quite a well-established pattern that we see. Interesting to note that actually the greatest increase here is in book chapters, not just journal articles that are available via the publisher's platform at that time. So I think, as I've argued, issues of censorship complicity haven't gone away in China. Coupled with this, since 2024, at the very earliest, if not earlier, we've seen the emergence of, I think, comparable conditions in the US that might compel publishers to self-censor. Obviously, this is a minute fraction of all the concerns we've seen coming out of the US, affecting scholarship. But I'd like to highlight two forms of censorship, if you like, or kind of pressures that I think bear the kind of closest parallel to what we see in China. So we have, for example, politically motivated retraction requests. We've seen it in the US and in China in recent years. And I think the most troubling from my perspective are politically motivated cancellations of journal packages and subscriptions. I think that's most troubling because it provides a kind of direct economic incentive for publishers to consider quite carefully what they're publishing in order to retain revenue through subscriptions or other means. And again, obviously, that was the leverage that the Chinese state had at the time, and it's a similar kind of power that's being wielded by some of the federal institutions in the US currently. Obviously, the mechanisms of censorship are very similar as well. As preoccupation with kind of problematic terminology, as Sara was describing earlier. On the left, and I can get into this more in the discussion later, are some of the topics that are sensitive in China, and actually some of the public policies that have been released about what you can and can't publish or import into China, and what the kind of content that would be inadmissible. And on the right, obviously, the much circulated list of keywords by PEN America that have been flagged up in federal research and prevented in some cases of being published. So despite those kind of clear parallels, I think there's one crucial difference, at least one in the China case versus the US. Scientific activity is obviously politically bound in China. It's not wholly autonomous, but I think it's fair to say it's not wholly directed towards a set of politically legitimate outcomes that are decided in advance, either in terms of the findings of research. I think if we contrast that with what we're seeing in the US around health research and around climate, with non-scientists dictating what they consider to be the acceptable findings that research ought to kind of lead to, and those that they think are unacceptable in areas like vaccination as well. I think we see closer parallels with what we saw in an earlier period in USSR and the USSR. I think we see a kind of closer parallel with what's known as the Lysenko affair, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Coined or kind of related to this figure, Trofim Lysenko, who was the director of the Institute for Genetics of the Soviet Academy of Sciences between the 30s and the 60s. It dictated the terms under which genetic science progressed, or rather stalled, in Soviet Russia and also in China by extension. So during this time, Lysenko pushed his own broadly discredited theory of heredity at the exclusion of all so-called reactionary Western capitalist theories of genetics, which in turn led to the USSR aggressively pushing his model of agricultural development, which precipitated many of the crop failures and famines that came to define the latter years of the communist experiment. At the time, Lysenko and this policy drew criticism from non-Soviet geneticists at the time, such as Julian Huxley, along lines, in comparable terms to the kind of critique that's been levied at the way that the kind of US administration is kind of controlling and redirecting science towards politically kind of predetermined or kind of legitimized results, and leading to this concern about a fragmentation in terms of the scientific method. So kind of discrediting of the scientific method in the US, and maybe this kind of splitting in terms of the scientific endeavor between one that is directed towards the scientific method and one that's directed towards political ideological aims. A concern that was very present at the time, I think is present now. So coming back to the present context, I think we're seeing threats both to the unity of the scientific method, but also to the public record of scientific and scholarly output. That's what we've seen in China. And I think, again, there are some pressures here that might be alarming in the US context too. I argue that the present structures and guidelines that we have to protect the scholarly record are to some extent insufficient to avoid a kind of global fragmentation in that record. And over the next couple of slides, I'd like to look at the Committee on Publication Ethics as a case in point, given it's the kind of primary body that's tasked with setting guidelines for the scholarly record. And here I have to give them plenty of credit here, especially as more or less relying on the labour of volunteers. That in the past couple of years, we've seen much more in the form of guidance around specific kinds of political influence, understandably in the present context, but how to handle censorship or external influence on editorial decisions, what to do if banned terminology can't be published in a output against an author's name, etc. So there's a lot of work being done in this area. I think as the central quote here from the guidance around editorial decisions kind of makes clear, the focus of COPE, as it always has been, is what happens leading up to the point of decision about whether a manuscript should be published and how to handle retractions as well. And I think for me, the most obvious problem with these guidelines as they stand is that they primarily concern that pre-publication requirement, but not the post-publication decisions about how content is made available, what the kind of metadata that's available on publisher platforms, and how we kind of understand the existence of the scholarly record, how it manifests in publisher platforms, which is kind of poorly regulated and might be argued, as I do, certain changes or limitations there could be construed as a form of editorial censorship if you're changing the nature of a published volume of content, for example. Given that kind of absence in the guidelines that set, this provided a reason, I think, for publishers to claim that they weren't engaging in editorial censorship and that they weren't kind of politically meddling with the content that they made available because the underlying content itself, the articles, haven't been tampered with, but just their kind of digital record of them having been published is a thing that's being changed. And again, I think COPE's position sort of tacitly endorses this, or at least doesn't contradict it explicitly. So given this in my research, I argue that this kind of emphasis on the integrity of the scholarly record as a function of editorial decision-making implies a kind of corpus ontology, that I'm calling a corpus ontology. So this idea that the scholarly record is a series of discrete items of content, and that the editor's role is paramount in terms of ensuring the integrity of those components. And I think this downplays the sort of digital manifestation of the record as a kind of interlinked hypertext, a resource in its own right that manifests in publisher platforms through series of linked and networked scholarly outputs. So this informs an expanded definition. It doesn't exclude that prior form, censorship at the point of editorial decision, but I think we need to bolt onto that and a kind of broader idea of the scholarly record, and of censorship in this context, which includes alterations to metadata and also to the details of journal volumes and content collections and things like that.
George, just giving you a quick time check.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, yes, I've only got a couple more minutes to go, I think. So in order to, if we were to accept on this expanded notion of censorship and to try and set some guidelines around it, I think one route to achieve this might be to push the existing body like COPE to endorse this kind of enhanced definition, which would be a good start. But I think my research has highlighted some kind of structural issues there that we might be conscious of. And I wouldn't be the first to raise these problems as well. Lots of people have in recent years about the way that COPE is set up and bodies like it are set up. You have a real risk of conflict of interest from funding sources because they're funded primarily through contributions from publishers themselves. And they have limited enforcement powers due to the kind of governance model that they have. All that COPE can do to enforce its kind of guidelines is to threaten publishers or whoever might be a member to use their membership. But it doesn't involve kind of concrete commercial repercussions for the publishers or individuals involved if they sidestep some of these guidelines. Given these concerns, some commentators like Jennifer Byrne here are pushing for external research integrity regulation and assessment, maybe through an ISO standard or an equivalent regulatory body. And I think these proposals could apply in the case of censorship as well, as a kind of subset of research integrity concerns. I think if we're going to get serious about resisting censorship and setting guidelines around it in scholarly publishing, we need a broader coalition of industry representatives, including librarians, academics, and ideally funders and indexers who have wield some power in terms of setting the standards under which research is made available, about what censorship is, and also some principles of transparency when research can't be made available, and when the scholarly record isn't fully available due to politically motivated concerns. And maybe this forum and forums like it could be one to advance this kind of broader governance model. Finally, just to kind of, before we get to the discussion, I'd like to highlight that although this might sound like an ambitious proposal, there are many initiatives that already exist that kind of have some aspects of this in terms of involvement from multi-stakeholders like publishers, librarians, academics, institutions, and so on, all pushing for something of mutual benefit. And they're bringing real commercial disadvantages for publishers not participating. So that's the case in many of the infrastructure. Examples we've got here, like Crossref and COPE and others, but also some of the kind of quite specific research integrity initiatives like United to Act to try and combat paper mills has this quality. And I'd like to close by just highlighting one example outside of scholarly publishing, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, but perhaps displays some of these principles quite well. So the Global Network Initiative, which is itself a non-governmental organization, it sets guidelines around how to prevent internet censorship and protect privacy. It was actually initiated by some of the leading players in the tech industry around the mid to late noughties. And again, companies that are part of this network, they're independently assessed every 2 years in terms of whether they're advancing the principles that this group was founded on to try and prevent censorship and to try and prevent sort of business practices that will lead to censorship or leads to sacrificing the privacy of users. And it has actually achieved some successes in terms of pushing back on practices that it was encouraged, that some of those companies were encouraged to adopt in China, because they could operate as a bloc in this way with the backing of non-industry players as well. So yeah, happy to discuss that more in the Q&A and something to come back to. But I think I'd just like to close by saying, I'm not suggesting that as an industry we need to force censorship resistance, but that's not legally possible on publishers and that there should be a group to do that. But I think we do need a better transparency and corporate social responsibility framework, and one that involves a broader set of stakeholders outside of the publishing industry as well. So I'd be really keen to kind of get your feedback on that idea. I've got a summary here, but I'll leave that for the slides that will be sent around afterwards, I'm sure. Quite keen to get over the Q&A. So yeah, thank you for listening and look forward to hearing feedback.
Wow, George, thank you so much. There was a lot there. It was a little hard to keep up with, but I'm going to try and weave things in that kind of came up in the chat and elsewhere. There's a couple questions for clarification that I thought would be good to flag. So Lucy's asking on the graph of censored research formats, which I think was like in the first third of your deck, is the chapter line so much higher because chapters in books tend to be treated like individual objects like journal articles? It was just noticeable how much higher chapters are.
Yeah, absolutely. So this comes back to the specific way that content is divided up and made available by that particular publisher. So obviously this might not be a broader trend across the entire industry, but there was at least one publisher during my research that was where these kind of discrepancies were more visible and more easy to research via their platform and the way that it's structured. But yes, the individual chapters were made available in the same way as like a journal article, as you could download them individually or search for them individually. And I suspect, as we kind of heard about in the Cambridge University Press case, that there may have been intermediaries that were just searching through their platform using their own platform infrastructure to identify content that they felt contained some of the keywords that are inadmissible in China and either compelling the publisher directly or submitting requests for them to censor along those lines. So yeah, I hope that answers.
Yeah, that was really helpful. Other questions in the uh, I'm sorry, I'm trying to wade across on some of the questions here. So, with quite a few librarians and information professionals on the call here, and they're wondering, and I think this is a question all of us are struggling with, is how do you find common cause regarding academic freedom with publishers, given the sort of inherently adversarial relationship that a lot of institutions have with publishers? And I mean, I think if anything, your presentation kind of reinforces that sinking feeling that commercial interests are trumping what's best for science and the decisions that some of these publishers have made. So how are you, to the extent that you've thought about that, how do we
Mm.
make that something that's a shared concern?
Mm. So, I mean, a couple of things I can speak to that came through from the interviews themselves. So, first of all, I was surprised that when I set out to do this research, I thought there might be a distinction in terms of what academics think censorship is and what publishers think censorship is. Maybe grounded in a misunderstanding of, on the academic side, of how publishers make available the content in the first place and the kinds of constraints that they might have with intermediaries and so on. But actually, there seemed to be a broad consensus that, okay, all of the things I've been talking about are actually censorship, and whatever the public statements might be, we all have that kind of shared understanding, which was good. And also on the values side, I certainly didn't speak to a single publisher who was kind of content with the position either their own employer or that the kind of industry had ended up at. And in many cases, they were quite actively trying to force or trying to bring about this kind of collaboration at the beginning. I think the problem is when publishers become, as I say, quite entrenched in their positions, and when there isn't very much scrutiny and the kind of commercial downsides for complying aren't very clear. I think when you speak to individuals in the industry, though, that there isn't a great values divide between academics and publishers. Publishers don't want to be censoring. People didn't get into publishing to censor their own
Right,
content.
right, right.
And I think that, I would kind of highlight the kind of thornier aspect of the dilemma for publishers and academics alike was like, what's in the best interest for people in the jurisdictions where you can't access that content? So if we took Chinese importers at their word and they blocked access to everything that, say, Springer Nature publishes because they wouldn't prevent a small fraction of their content from being available, is great for the publisher in terms of saying this, we're being strident and we're sticking to our principles, but is it actually in the best interest for Chinese researchers for them to take that position? And I think that's quite a tough ethical dilemma. And again, we don't, because it was happening in behind closed doors, we didn't really get to have that discussion about what's best for people in the places where they're affected. And I think that's where the dividing line is about the kind of ethics of what you do for your readers rather than a kind of what's commercially expedient always.
Yeah, I mean that was kind of a recurring question for me is, what is the one of the conversations we have in defend research is there's a kind of, you know, small amount of compliance that allows you to fly under the radar so you can
Mm.
further your mission and your work um, unimpeded, right? And so what are those trade-offs around,
Yeah.
when do you cross the line into being complicit versus
Mm.
being pragmatic for the ends that you seek? So I
Mm.
think that is going to continue to be a tension. This is the classic case of when we ask people, why do you work for this administration? Why are you, you know, allowing yourself to be pulled into this kind of work? And the classic argument is, well, if I'm in there, I can
Yeah.
stop bad things from happening, right? And
Yeah.
so the question becomes, how does that work? The
Yeah.
a follow up to that I had was, science is a global endeavor. One of the conversations we just had at UKSG was that, certainly what's happening in the US feels extremely acute and is being talked about very broadly, but it impacts everyone because of
Mm.
that global nature. And so I'm wondering, like, did Chinese researchers realize that they were not accessing everything they need because they're obviously engaging with researchers globally? And then conversely, did the authors that were being censored, the editors, the journals that were, did they know that their
Mm.
content, like what was the awareness on either side
Mm. So I
of
would,
missing out?
yeah, yeah. That's a really, really good question. I would love to have been able to use a methodology to understand the answer to the first one better because I'm having to rely on anecdotal evidence. I didn't interview, say, readers of content in China. I didn't interview anyone who was based in China at the time. For understandably, yeah, either difficult in terms of access or they didn't want to speak, which is fine. So most of the people I spoke to were either Chinese academics overseas or individuals who had had their work censored but weren't themselves based in China. Um, and yes, from the author's perspective, uh, I think authors, in some cases, they were surprised to find out that their work was unavailable. So they didn't know already. And again, it speaks to that kind of like climate of uncertainty. Um, but there was a kind of dilemma that you would see for authors who either need access to China or are based in China, where if they for promotion within an institution, just like in the UK or anywhere else, you bring up your list of publications. If the person assessing your publication record clicks through to something that's been 404'd, it looks like you've made it up. And
Yeah.
there are concerns already about fraud in China and elsewhere that many people are, in good faith trying to tackle, and it makes that process difficult. So this idea that it doesn't really harm anyone anyway, like our Chinese researchers will use VPNs, which was the kind of most common anecdotal bit of evidence I got, which is fair enough. But in terms of the scholarly record doing what it's meant to do, provide that public verified record of what has been published and that it's gone through that process of peer review, etc. That's still being tampered with, and it doesn't look the same in all contexts, and that does have repercussions, quite tangible repercussions, I think, for authors.
There's some really good questions in the chat, so I want to flag them. Jennifer's had a couple. I think you might have touched on this, but I think I missed it. What are your thoughts on algorithmic or technical censorship, right?
Mm.
Metadata omission. So, you can't, the idea of geofencing by VPN feels very
Yeah.
like kind of the obvious thing to do. But I think, Jennifer, what you're suggesting is, basically structuring the metadata in such a way that it would just not be discoverable, which strikes me as impacting a broader range of people than just people in one geographic area. But yet, to what extent have you been wrestling with that or thinking about that in
Yeah,
this project?
I certainly have, and I think that is a solution that publishers did explore to some extent or did put into place, where the content, if you have this, for example, the DOI, you can get it, you can get access to the record, but if you search on their platform, you can't find it, which it seemed to be like a kind of middle ground solution. As far as I understand it, that's still censorship. It's a kind of suppression of content along political lines. And it would be described as censorship in other contexts. We look at like what happens on social media platforms, for example, and the way that some Western companies operate in China. That's exactly the case. Actually, that's how they get around this problem. The information is underlying information is in principle available and accessible if you use a VPN, but it might be suppressed through a search function. So I don't think it's a way of publishers getting around the question of whether they're censoring. Maybe it has fewer repercussions. Again, in the case that I talked about, where authors, if they know, again, the direct link to find the content, or at least find the record of its publication, can use that to demonstrate its existence. I think when the existence is hidden, that's particularly problematic and insidious. So it's a censorship in terms of discoverability, but not in terms of the kind of like existence of the content. And yeah, I think publishers again will have to make their own decision about where they want to sit in terms of that spectrum of censorship, if you like, from just not selling content that might be problematic to suppressing algorithmically to pretending that it doesn't exist altogether. So there is a bit of a spectrum there.
And Jen is just quickly following up, asking, how would we know that that kind of censorship is happening? Is the point is that you can't really, when
Yeah,
that technical censorship is happening?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, publishers will cover their tracks, so it can be very difficult to determine that. I was fortunate. It's maybe a kind of interesting word choice, but fortunate to discover a publisher that was kind of, as I say, self-censoring in a way that was at least technically discoverable, and to study it. But in most cases, I didn't have evidence in that sense of like, oh, I can use a VPN and see what you can't see, sort of thing.
Did did
So,
did you disclose in your research like which publishers? I mean, I guess you can't really say who you talked to, right?
no,
How
I
did
don't
you?
think. Yeah, I disclosed the publisher's platform, the publisher platforms that I looked at. I didn't disclose the details of the publisher that was self-censoring in the way that I described, for a number of reasons. First, I mean, the objective of the research is not to name and shame individual publishers and their individual practices. It's to illustrate the kind of presence of this issue and that we need better standards and guidelines to try and encourage collaboration. And I didn't think that individually, like naming and shaming was the right way to go about it. Also, at the time, I was partly an employee of an academic publisher, so there
Yeah,
would be a conflict of interest there as well, which I was having to
right,
manage
right,
that research. But ultimately, I'm not here to moralize about what
right.
publishers should,
Hmm.
should do individually, where they sit on that spectrum that I just described. What I think I do want to push for, and I think we all should, is greater transparency. There's no reason why publishers couldn't have a framework where if you decide where you're going to sit on that spectrum, you release a statement of some kind to say, look, okay, this content's not available for you in China for this reason, and to be more transparent about that, and for there to be some kind of guidelines around that. And so some better disclosure around the political constraints that people face. We already have some guidelines like that when it comes to like retraction notices or changes to the scholarly
Right.
record in the way that COPE defines it. But in terms of how publisher platforms are structured and how the data is made available, it's very unregulated in terms of that transparency, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I was just, your point about COPE sort of being the United Nations of this whole issue, very, very, very unable to not only enforce, but the conflict of interest part was something that I hadn't thought about. And it is actually
Mm.
quite alarming when you stop to think about it. A big conversation that we've been having in the US is the shocking realization that how many of the things that we thought were given are norms rather than
Mm.
actual laws. And so as they erode, we can clutch our pearls, but we actually have no legal redress.
Mhm.
A conversation I've had quite a bit in the UK, which I found really interesting, is in the UK, academic freedom defined a certain way is actually protected by law, as
Mm.
opposed to freedom of speech was kind of a different thing, and the parameters of that are not as protected in terms of your ability to not face consequences for that. But this is a very long way of asking: is this the kind of thing that needs to be legislated, addressing publisher behavior, or is
Mm.
that too? Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I, I haven't explored whether legislation could or ought to be in the kind of mechanism whereby we force some standards here that the publishers have to stick to, um, simply because I think of the kind of global context within which publishers are working, and the scholarly record itself, this idea that is a global resource, like under what kind of legislative framework, like regionally or geographically, would that happen? I think there is maybe um, some questions to explore about how some of the practices or some forms of self-censorship practices that publishers might use might come into conflict with human rights legislation. That's something that Google and other tech firms had to grapple with towards the end of
Right.
the 2010s, or around sort of 2007, 2008, I think, when it came to providing a self-centered search platform and the legality of doing that, or to the extent to which they would come into conflict with human rights legislations defined by the EU and other bodies. And so I think there's parallel kind of legal concerns here. I'm not a lawyer by training, so I'm
Sure.
not going to wade into that. But that was again the impetus for the Global Network Initiative as well, was like
Mm,
to ensure, to provide a kind of transparency framework and a way of externally and independently assessing whether publishers are sticking to their obligations in overseas markets. And again, we don't have a mechanism like that for scholarly publishing, and I think that's a problem.
yeah, yeah, for sure. So in the closing minutes here, what is it you wanted our audience to kind of take away from this body of research, uh,
Mhm.
either as hopeful or and again, you're not sort of taking a normative, you're not making too many normative claims here, but what would be your parting message to this community be with respect to these issues and what it might mean in the American context, since that's feeling really acute right now.
Mm. I think my hopeful message is that what's happening in the United States, given where so much of the scholarly publishing industry, the mainstream industry that is, kind of sits on the boards and has so much influence on many of these trade bodies is based. There's a huge amount, I would say, more attention on what's happening in the US context than what was happening at the time in China when I was doing my research. And I think the presence of all these efforts to track every instance of US government censorship and to kind of scrutinize what publishers are doing is really, really healthy and really good. And I think the most important thing is we keep up that momentum, that we properly invest our time and efforts in initiatives like this, but also, don't stop looking out for examples of the kinds of censorship that I've described in my research, and try and bring together forums of kind of mutual interest. I would say, I mean, I work for a large, commercial publisher. I think an us versus them mentality is the wrong way to go when it comes to trying to force greater collaboration. As I say, these large companies are made up of people who really care about this issue and are trying their best under very difficult circumstances to internally set guidelines and internally try and manage huge kind of ethical dilemmas all of the time. And I think if we can take advantage of this momentum and try and encourage more conversations across the industry, and again with different stakeholders outside of it as well, then we might make some more progress than we did in the China case.
That's really, I think, a really, really good place to end it. And George, I can't thank you enough for your expertise today. There's some questions we couldn't get to, so we'll share them with George and hopefully follow up offline. In the meantime, I really encourage folks to join us May 7th for another conversation, this time with a political scientist and a dear friend, looking at the context of academic freedom and scientific independence in the context of a very polarized political environment. We will make George's recording and slides available, and I'm sure he's eager to answer questions and share more information about the body of work that he's running. So to everyone who joined us, really appreciate the time you spent. George, please continue to share this work as it evolves. I think it's really powerful. And with that, I hope we can see everyone May 11th, but until then, stay strong, rest, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, George.
Thanks very much.